The brothers ran through the town. Lucas slowed to a stop after a time, waving at Reuben to do the same. "All right, you win," Lucas gasped, hunched forwards and holding his side. I can't go on any more." "How's the injury doing?" Reuben asked, turning back to him. "Getting better," Lucas answered, straightening up. "It feels a hell of a lot better than it did the other day," he smiled. "I think it's even stopped bleeding." "Good. Can we walk from here?" Lucas asked. "I'm not sure I'm up for running and jumping around anymore." "Sure," Reuben nodded. They ambled side by side, walking at a gentle pace through the town as they headed to the train station. But before they came close to the station, Lucas pulled back, spotting a short distance away a figure he recognized. "Ebony?" She bowed her head shyly, realizing she had been spotted. Lucas changed direction, striding up to her. Reuben hesitated for a moment before following, wondering in his head who this new person was. She smiled at Lucas, but appeared to become a little nervous as Reuben approached. "What are you doing here?" Lucas asked her, standing in the shaded patch before the coffee shop where Ebony was hovering. Ebony clung to the gate behind her, leaning into the metal bars like they would offer her some sort of protection. "I found you," she uttered. "It was all by chance. I was wandering the town for hours." "Why?" Lucas asked her. Ebony averted her attention. I wanted to see you." Reuben glanced sideways, giving his brother a devious look. "Lucas," he said in a mock tone, "you didn't tell me you met a lady friend. What were you doing when I was in hospital?" "Oh, but what would Cyan think?" Lucas grimaced, speaking patiently as his eyebrow twitched in annoyance. "You know it's not like that," he huffed. "God, you're starting to sound like Lorelei." "Who's Lorelei?" Ebony asked him. "Nobody," Lucas answered shortly. "Just another stupid girl." "Another?" Ebony spoke tentatively, eyes beginning to shimmer. "I mean," Lucas began. "That is, I didn't mean, I wasn't calling you stupid," he said hurriedly. He glanced at his brother for support. "No, keep going," Reuben told him. "Soon you'll need a ladder to get out of this grave you're digging for yourself." "Why do I even ask for your help anyway?" Lucas muttered to him, shaking his head and narrowing his eyes at him. Ebony blushed, avoiding looking at either of them now. Her companion, the toy named Pokey, who had been hiding behind her up until that point, suddenly made itself known. "You can see me as well?" the toy said to Reuben as he noticed the surprised expression on his face. "You must be a guardian too." "What the hell?" Reuben exclaimed. "Hey," he smiled suddenly, looking at the girl now in a whole new light. "You're a guardian too. That's great. So are we." "Reuben," Lucas said to him, gathering himself. "This is Ebony and Pokey," he said, indicating the toy. "Hello, Reuben." Ebony smiled politely. "Lucas has told me so much about you." "He has he?" Reuben said, raising an eyebrow. "Good things, I hope." "Of course," Ebony replied. Reuben's attention drifted past her, and he glanced with curiosity at the toy again. "What's wrong with you?" the toy spat bitterly as Reuben began to stare. "It's like you've never seen magic before." "I'm sorry," Ebony said in a hushed voice. "He gets a little jealous at times." "I can tell." Reuben frowned sceptically at the thing floating in the air. It didn't have any facial expressions of any kind, but its body language said more than enough. The toy didn't like him either. "So," Lucas began, speaking to Ebony, "what are you doing out here? Why were you looking for me?" "Lucas," Ebony began uncertainly, "you said that you'd help me if ever I needed it." She looked at the ground, holding her hands behind her back. "Well, I think I need your help now." They headed home instead of going to the train station, Ebony walking with them. Once they reached the apartment, Lucas, seeing how tired Ebony was, allowed her to sleep in their mother's bedroom. They had talked briefly before Ebony lay down to rest. Lucas placed a thin blanket over her, drawing the curtains shut. He paused only briefly to watch as Pokey padded in circles beside Ebony on the bed, before lying down next to her. Lucas turned away, closing the bedroom door quietly, leaving Ebony and Pokey alone together. "She looks like she hasn't slept all night," Lucas spoke to his brother in a hushed voice as they stood before the bedroom door. "Is she okay?" Reuben immediately began to interrogate in a whisper. Lucas nodded. "Apparently she's going through a hard time right now." "Nothing that time wouldn't mend, right?" Reuben said enthusiastically. "She said her foster parents don't see her anymore," Lucas continued. "Literally, not even when she yells and screams." He shook his head. "I tell you what, Reuben, there's something strange about her. I know when a guardian uses magic, most other people are unable to see it, but I've never heard of this before. Can guardians be invisible to other people? Reuben asked. If they chose to be, I suppose. Lucas shrugged. He walked away, shaking his head. I don't know. Maybe time will solve this mystery. Reuben followed his brother into the bedroom they shared. It was a small apartment that they lived in, and there was not a lot of room to spare. What if our mother comes back and finds her? Reuben asked. It will be like the three little bears, sort of. Who's been sleeping in my bed? I'm not afraid of her any more, Lucas replied simply, taking a seat at the desk against the far wall. Reuben marched over to the bunk bed, stepping over the messy pile of clothes and books on the floor. He collapsed onto the lower bed, lying back with his hands behind his head, staring up at the dusty dream catcher above him. Are you starting another one? He asked Lucas absent-mindedly. Yep. Lucas adjusted the light on the table briefly, before returning his attention to the little metal ball he held, about the size of a golf ball. It had many shallow ridges and grooves running upon it, with what looked like tiny screw heads protruding out from the surface. He placed this one to the side, picking up another piece of what looked like scrap metal. This one was shaped like a burnt piece of paper that had curled and scrunched up as it blackened in a fire. Are you making another smoke bomb? Reuben sighed deeply. No, Lucas replied after a while. I'm making something else. What does it do? It explodes when you pick it up, Lucas said, and magic wires tie you down so you can't escape. Does it work? I don't know, Lucas shrugged. I'm still designing it and I haven't had a chance to test it yet. Reuben hummed thoughtfully, tapping his foot against the wall. I like the purple smoke from the smoke bomb, Reuben said. Me too. The desk was scattered with loose bits of metal, pots of paint, brushes, and a variety of strange substances. Lucas pushed some of these things aside, creating more space for himself. He lifted the item he held in his hand, heating the metal in his fingers by magic. He began to work. Are we going back to college later? Reuben asked him. I don't think so. What about the exams? To me, they seem to matter less and less with every passing day, Lucas replied. Yeah, Reuben said. I feel the same. He sighed deeply again. What about Ebony? Is she staying here now? I suppose, Lucas said, until she and her foster parents make up with each other. Reuben stared up at the dream catcher. I'll bet they'll make up with each other in no time, Reuben said, and then everything will be okay. As the days turned into weeks, and Reuben found Lucas spending more and more time with Ebony, she was reserved and quiet, timid amongst strangers, and although she was friendly enough, Reuben began to form a gradually and increasing resentment towards her. Most of the time she took up most of his brother's time, and her foster parents showed no sign of acknowledging her, let alone wanting her back. And so she stayed at their apartment. Her only possessions were a few clothes and other meagre things. She spent most of her time either at the flat or with Lucas out somewhere, Reuben feeling more and more like he was simply tagging along. Reuben began to get suspicious of her when he found her, on more than one occasion, drifting into their bedroom. She saw the things on the desk and grew curious. Reuben quickly drove her out, subjected to harsh whispered words from his brother afterwards. A simmering tension began to bubble. It had been many weeks since Reuben, Lucas and Drake had visited the abandoned hotel within the industrial estate to practice their magic. Drake was spending more and more time with his girlfriend Eleanor, helping her revise for the coming exams, as was Lucas with Cyan for the same reason. Lucas and Drake both travelled together on the train most weekends to see them, Lucas doing so whenever he could afford it. Ebony, too scared to leave the town, chose to stay in the apartment. Reuben agreed somewhat grudgingly to Lucas's suggestion that he should keep her company. On that occasion, one Saturday morning, Reuben found himself sitting in silence and staring at her. The clock ticked loudly on the wall as he fidgeted with his cast. I don't have to stay here, you know, Ebony said politely, feeling a little out of her depths and lost without Lucas to keep her company. I'm not keeping you from going out. Lucas told me to keep an eye on you, Reuben said stubbornly, perhaps not realizing how stupid he was being. I have to stay here. Oh, Ebony bowed her head. Reuben sighed, leaning back in the comfy armchair and closing his eyes. I wonder what Lucas is doing right now, he thought. The town Eleanor and Cyan lived in was one more open and less crowded than the one Drake and Lucas came from. There were fewer large shops to attract crowds, fewer abandoned buildings to attract the wrong people, and the town itself was generally cleaner and more pleasant. Cyan turned, leaning against the rails on the edge of the harbour, holding the books in her hands. The wind was strong, buffeting her clothes and hair this way and that. It was a bright town, built right next to the sea with a wide river running right through the middle. Small ferries channeled people to and fro all day and night, and now in summer there were more tourists visiting to see the attractions. From a distance, Cyan watched a family as they explored the deck of an old Navy ship, the children pointing with excitement at its huge masts. It was a beautiful ship, one of the many attractions a local museum had to offer. "Cyan, come away from the edge," Lucas said to her. Lucas, Drake and Eleanor sat on the steps at the base of a statue of an old man, he leaning forwards on a rope with a ringing bell at the top. "It's too windy there," Lucas called over to her. "You'll lose your notes." She swung her arms round and ambled over to him. "Do you think it's such a good idea doing this outside?" Eleanor said, tidying up her papers, which were trying to fly away. "It's always so windy here, we could lose all our notes, and I'm not swimming to get them back." "Hey, I'd make the most of it," Drake yawned, twirling his pen. "Before long they'd have us cooped up in exam halls like battery chickens, labouring away on something most of us would probably never use again in our lives." Cyan planted herself right onto Lucas's lap, where his books had been sitting open. He had been halfway through the paragraph until she came along. She was now applying lipstick in a mirror and ignoring him completely. "You know you're not making this easy for me," Lucas droned at her. His phone began to buzz in his pocket and he flipped it out. It was a message from Jacob. "Just got back. Where are you guys?" Lucas began to text a response. Hands behind Cyan so she could not read what he wrote. "Great, hope you had fun. Any sign of any magic yet?" He received a quick and short response. "No." Lorelei threw her head back, laughing hysterically. She was sitting in between the two brothers, Adrian and Diz. Since that day, Drake had been so kind enough to introduce her to them. The three had spent more and more time together, and Lorelei was becoming very familiar with both of them and their quirky habits. It still amazed her how different the two brothers were from each other. The park bench on which they rested was positioned before a large fountain. It was a scenic spot within the town, made up of gravel paths with borders of flowers arranged by their colour, lots of grass you weren't allowed to walk on, and beautiful trees planted everywhere. The three sat beneath a weeping willow. Tiny patches of light that fought through the leaves of the tree were scattered in patterns around them. Lorelei took a deep breath, smelling the scene of the flowers in the air. The park was a little piece of nature within their hometown. "I love the birds," Lorelei beamed. "They're really beautiful." She shredded the slice of bread into tiny pieces and cast her hand out. The sparrows and starlings came flitting down, picking at her feet. "They're not as beautiful as you," Adrian purred. He turned his wrist up as he faced her, uncurling his fingers in a graceful action, and like a magician, smooth and elegant, he flicked a beautiful red rose from his sleeve and presented it to her. She laughed even more now, her voice like glistening dew on a winter's morning. "You're so funny," she said, taking it from him and smelling it. "How long have you been hiding that there, I wonder, waiting for the right moment to show me? I've got something for you I think you'd like more," Diz voiced sweetly from her other side. He handed her a single boiled sweet. "It's orange like your hair," he said. Lorelei blushed and grinned at him. Adrian leant back and cast him a comical frown. "Really?" he asked his younger brother. "Oh, Diz, that's so sweet of you," Lorelei said, taking it. "You're so cute," she squeaked. Diz flashed his brother a smug grin. Adrian rolled his eyes. "So when are you going to teach me how to dance?" Lorelei demanded. "It was just amazing watching you for the first time, the timing, the way you moved, the way you danced together." "Oh, my dear," Adrian said in a serious tone, "it's not just simple movement, it's an art, an expression of our being. There are some things in today's world that cannot be felt in words alone." Adrian stood up and walked a short distance away from her, hands in his pocket, the birds scattered. "The unique characteristics of street dancing, my dear, allows one to use their own personal style and influences in his steps." Adrian gave a brief demonstration. "It's not a dance that's rigid in its rules as to what exactly it should constitute. It's open to the imagination." He cast his arms open in a dramatic fashion. "Are you ready to begin?" "It's really fun," Diz said, leaning forward. His words formed round a lollipop he had materialized out of nowhere. Adrian and I spent years practicing to get where we are now. So many hours every single day. Right, Adrian? Adrian lowered his arms. That's right, little brother. Where did you get that lolly from? Lorelei asked Diz, suddenly distracted. I've got loads, he grinned at her. Want some? Adrian put his hands on his hips. He shook his head, sighing, then gave a huff of amusement. My dear girl, he said, you will be the death of me. Shire saw her from a distance. Lorelei was sitting talking to two young men on a bench by the fountain. Shire had watched them for a long while from the opposite end of the park, fascinated by Lorelei's every move, but something distracted her then. A voice carried on the wind. Shire raised her head, turning away from her newfound obsession and looking towards the edge of the town. Trapped in a world full of betrayal, only the angels trusted. Demons are fleeing, fearful, frightened, weapons and swords now rusted. I can hear her, Shire breathed.